Hello there, this is the WION Sports broadband edition with me, Digvijay Singh Deo. Now, as the coronavirus pandemic rages around the world, sporting czars are trying to come up with solutions. But in the sport of Formula One, it seems the eternal power struggle is continuing. I am joined now by one of the most prominent voices in Formula One. He's also just one of two Indians to race in the sport, Karun Chandhok. Karun, thanks for waking up early in the morning and doing this for me. But first question: you're in England and been seeing your tweets. The situation there is pretty dire at the moment.
Yeah, it's not a great situation, especially since the Prime Minister himself has now been taken into the ICU in the last 48 hours. So it is tough. I think to be honest, it's the same as the rest of the world. I don't think it's worse necessarily than the rest of Europe. It's just everyone's tracking a different curve and a different timeline. I think in a country like India, it's difficult to know what the real numbers are because the population is so high and the number of tests aren't enough. Same as the US. So we've all got the same problem. I think every country is trying to deal with it the best way they can.
Okay, but for you and Akshara as well, you all have an extremely young family. So for the both of you, more precautions required. I mean, I saw a tweet from you saying you do go out at times with the stroller, but and you were pretty upset to see people roaming around.
Yeah, I mean, we're very lucky, Diggy, because we live away from the town. We live in the suburbs of the city, outside of London. So actually, we're very lucky that, I think the whole town that I live in has less people than my colony in Madras, where I grew up. So there's only 11,000 people here, which means that it's quiet. We can go for walks at least, and we're able to go in the countryside. There's a forest right across the road, so we can go for walks, and it's quiet, and you can still carry on the self isolation process and be away from people, which is nice. But it's difficult. I think especially if you lived in the if you lived in the heart of a city, wherever it was, whether you're in Delhi, Mumbai, London, New York, Tokyo, I think it's difficult to find space to isolate.
Mm. And the Chandoks scattered all over the world. You're outside of London. Your
Yeah.
brothers are broadcasters, are probably stuck in Mumbai.
Yeah.
Your parents stay in Chennai as well. So lots of Skype calls, lots of WhatsApp video calls, perhaps, to keep the family
Yeah.
connected.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in fact, it was my dad's birthday yesterday,
Oh, okay.
and we had a Zoom call across the world with about 22 different family members who are from Australia to America to Europe, and of course all over India as well. So yeah, I think everyone's finding different ways. I just wish I'd bought shares in Zoom. Really, I think when the coronavirus started, I think that would have been a useful investment to do.
Yeah. But let's get back to now what's happening in your sport. Canadian Grand Prix gone as well now. So just like that, 9 races of the season, first 9 races of the Formula One season gone. Just like that.
Yeah, but it's not just like that, is it? It's been happening over time. I think the reality is they're announcing it slowly, but it's because there's not been a mad rush to announce things. Each promoter and each race can take their time. Um, uh, you know, I don't think we can start till August, is my personal belief. And that's being optimistic. Listen, I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how long this situation is going to carry on for. But from what I read and watch on the news, it sounds like the summer months should be able to flatten the curve out and stop the spread. And the thing is, for F1, unlike Wimbledon, for example, Diggy, or the IPL or the Premier League, which is contained to one country, F1 is a global sport. So
Mm.
until we're able to get to a situation where the whole world can start traveling again, it doesn't matter if the issue is solved in Europe, but they still have a problem in North America or in Asia. Formula One can't function because we need people coming from all over the world, and therefore that's I think that's the slightly tricky part for F1 is it needs the world situation to be resolved. But on the flip side, we can still have a part season, unlike something like the IPL. I mean, I guess IPL can be pushed later in the year, but think something like Wimbledon had to happen at that time of the year. There was no flexibility around it. Whereas because F1 is a global sport, you can race in the Middle East countries in the winter, you can race in the European countries during August, September. So you can juggle the calendar around to still have a season of some form.
Yeah, I'm gonna get to that in more detail, but I just want to step back maybe a month from where we are right now
Hmm.
to Melbourne, because
Hmm.
the farcical scenes that we saw at the Australian GP, just before the Australian GP actually got underway, sort of tamasha, if it's the right word, what we saw, fans turning up in the morning to see the practice session, being told it's not happening. F1 has this reputation at times of being a snobbish sport, and these images will not hold the sport in good stead over the when you judge what happened and how various sports reacted to the pandemic.
Yeah, but I think it's wrong to solely blame F1 in for what happened in Australia. I think the reality was that there were three parties involved in the decision-making process, right? One is Formula One and Chase Carey, who is the boss, of course, of the sport at the moment. Um, One is there was the Australian government, and the local promoter of the Australian Grand Prix, the Australian Grand Prix Corporation, and then you've got the FIA with John Todd. Now, it was a perfect storm because Chase Carey had been to Vietnam to evaluate the situation there, and he was on the plane on Thursday coming in. Um, Jean Todt, I don't believe, was in Australia at the time, so they had to communicate with him back in Europe, and it's quite a big time difference. Um, and I think for the Australian promoter, there was the commercial considerations because for them it's a big business, and
Mm.
they've got to maintain their relationship with the government. And there's government procedures that had to be followed. So I think it was a perfect storm. I think the issue which was probably not handled well was not communicating to the fans correctly. I think even on the Friday morning, there was still news on the radio at 7 a.m. telling fans that it was happening, and people were
Mm.
queuing up at the gate. And I think that was an error. The rest of it is very difficult for us to sit on our sofas and judge people and blame people for the decision. But they had to. There's so many layers that need to be considered. So I'd say the only thing I would really perhaps point square fault for was the lack of communication, maybe to the fans.
Okay, fair enough. Now getting back to how do you fit the season? It's like a jigsaw puzzle in a sense.
Mm.
Bernie Eccleston, the former supremo of Formula One, someone you know pretty well, says that the season's a write-off. With Canada going, with France in a sense not happening as well, and as you said, you're looking at August, perhaps August. Uh, can a season eventually happen? I think Chase Carey said you need at least a minimum of 8 races to constitute a calendar and a world championship.
Yes, that's correct. So first of all, eight rounds makes an FIA World Championship. I think if you look at between August and let's assume we run into I don't know, let's say even third week of December, right? There's enough weeks and weekends to logistically manage 12 or 13 races. So it's doable. I think the biggest question is when can we start?
Mm.
There are enough European venues who will be ready and willing to host races. If the WHO and the governments clear it, certainly I think we can run all the European races. So, you can have 6 or 7 European rounds. We could definitely do Bahrain and Abu Dhabi. I think they would be able to run towards the end in December. We can probably manage.
Singapore, it can happen as well.
You could manage. No, I don't think you can manage Singapore because Singapore will have to build the track, right? Don't forget it's a street
Okay.
track. So I think for Singapore to happen, they need to know at least 3 months in advance. So yes, it could happen in December. but it means they would need to get a green light in August. So
Mm.
there's a slightly more complicated situation there. But I'll tell you what, the Chinese race, they've announced Shanghai is going to be open for business again. The track is open again in June. So we could go back to China, which would be an amazing story considering this is where the whole thing started. And you could do one quick North American leg, depending on how the pandemic situation is there. You could do Austin, Mexico. So, um, there's potential to still manage 10, 10 or 12 races. The I think the key is going to be when we get the green light to start.
Okay, another factor which F1 is also looking at is perhaps having races behind closed doors. Now, I spoke to Rohan Bopana a couple of days back and asked him because there is a proposal that perhaps tennis could resume behind closed doors. And Rohan says that, in tennis, as far as tennis goes, he says, forget the fans, forget the atmosphere for a moment. The fact remains that players have to fly in, referees have to fly in, and there are other people involved in hosting a race. There are quarantine regulations as well, as we saw with Vietnam as well. When there was those negotiations going on. So these are other factors as well. Just thinking of hosting a race behind closed doors isn't sort of the answer, because unlike the UFC, which has a private island, which Dana White is telling us that they're going to have these bouts there, that's not going to happen in the real world. And as you said, the Italians will come in from the Ferrari team comes in from there. Austria has Red Bull. Most of the teams are in England, bit around where you are. So, all those things have to be considered. Will governments be willing to allow them in?
Yeah, but that's exactly the point. And I think, as I said at the beginning, I think in F1 situation, until globally there's a green light for travel to resume and quarantines to be waived, and or quarantines to be cancelled, or all of these, the bans lifted on a global level, then I think we can
Hmm.
start to resume the sport.
But economically, how much of a hit will the sport take or is taking, even if you have a reduced race, like we were just discussing? So let's say about 12 or 13 races are possible, even then, because already staff are being furloughed, already staff have taken pay cuts, F1 bosses are taking pay cuts. Obviously, people like you who are associated with the eco sport of Formula One also have to, sort of, your
There's
checks
a
could
loss
be
of income,
reduced.
of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is a loss. I didn't want to say it in as many words,
Oh, it's true.
but all this has to be factored in as well. Can the sport survive? Because that's the other thing that the teams are coming forward and saying. Is it very essential
Listen,
that we have to have a season?
listen, Diggy, I think the reality is the whole world is taking a hit. Can name one business, one industry, whether it's your local dukan or
Mm.
your telecoms or your airlines or your hotels, everyone is going to take a big hit this year. The stock markets have
Even
plunged
even Ria,
to
even
the
Ria.
floor. Yeah, media houses, I think everyone's taking a hit, right? So Formula One is no different. I think to your question, will Formula One survive this? I think it's. I think everyone is in the same boat. Survival is based on how you react and your financial means to react. F1 are making some key decisions. For example, there was a big rules change coming for
Mm.
2021, which was going to be an expensive change because anytime you have to completely change the concept and design of cars, it's expensive. They pushed that back. It's already gone to 22. They're talking about possibly moving it back to 23, which is a huge cost saving straight away. They're talking about freezing the 2020 car and telling teams to race it again in 21. So that again, even without a rules change, it means that they say the huge cost of not having to design and build another car. So the sport is reacting and doing things. I think the owners and promoters of the sport, Liberty and the Formula One group, are very aware of what they need to do to help the team survive. I think whether it means like think of it like a government, right? Any government is having to put together a package to help industry and help businesses.
Mm.
Um, and in the same way, I think in F1, in a smaller scale, that they are having to put together a package to say, listen, we will give you X million to survive this crisis, and
Mm.
then they will have to find a way to generate that because F1 as a sport are also losing out, right? There's the rights fees for races aren't coming in. There's less sponsorship coming in when you don't have races. If you're not racing, people are not paying in terms of income. So
Yeah, but hang on,
there's a
I just
hit.
want to expand on. I want to expand on that because see, you understand the sport much better because you are part of the
Sure, sure.
sport, not just as a driver and a commentator. You part of the ecosystem. So McLaren come out and say a couple of days back, Zach Brown, that 2 to 4 teams could go out of business. How significant are the operating margins? That with this income not coming in, teams could fold. What are the monies we're looking at? What is the bare minimum for a team to generate in terms of all the monies you mentioned to survive?
So let's say a top team. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we have to work on the assumption that as long as the parent companies and the factories carry on supporting them, then Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari will be fine. They're the big teams. They've got financial muscle to survive this. The questions remain over Renault, for example. They as a car company, it's the entire automotive industry is taking a hit in India and worldwide, as we know. So, I'm sure people at the Renault board are wondering how much they need to spend on F1 or do they need to cut back. Then you have the independent teams, right? So that's your four manufacturers, and you've got your six independent teams. The independent teams spend about £100 million a year, is what they need to survive and compete for a season. Now that is a normal season of 22 races. Let's keep also in mind, if you're doing less races, it's costing you less money. You're not
Mm.
traveling as much. You're not running the cars. The engines are used only half as much. That's 10 million of saving. So there are other savings by not racing as well. So what the teams now need to work out is that formula, because their overheads are still the same, right? They've still got the employees, although as you mentioned, Racing Point, McLaren, and Williams have announced they're furloughing a lot of their staff. But the overheads of the factory and the overheads of the the infrastructure are still high for a team. So now they need to figure out a way to still generate, let's say, and this is I'm generalizing across six
Obviously, yeah.
teams. They still need to generate, let's say, 60, 70 million, right? Now, a huge portion of that comes from the rights income. A huge portion comes from Formula One, from TV rights, from media rights, from race hosting rights. So, you know, the teams, all of this money goes to a pot. The teams share about 65% roughly of that pot. Formula One group keep the other 35 as their profit. So now, in order for the teams to survive and therefore the sport to survive, will Formula One group change that equation? Will they change that balance? Will they do a one-off top-up and say, listen, to help you guys through this crisis, we're going to give all of you a bonus of X amount, which is what MotoGP have done, by the way, for the independent teams. For MotoGP fans who are also missing out on the sport because they've also not raced so far. Dorna, the promoter, has given each of the independent teams X amount of money and said, listen, here's this. This should help you pay your salaries and help you pay your factory rent and your whatever for the next few months. So there are equations in play here to try and help the team survive.
Okay, there's also these meetings which are going on to talk about budget cuts, a budget cap. Now, you mentioned the three big teams, the Ferrari,
Mm.
Mercedes, and Red Bull, and then sort of then the rest coming in. These teams are also saying that we are also manufacturers, so we spend significant money on research and development, and then we sell parts to the other teams as well. There's sort of merit there as well, no, Karun. It's
Yes.
if I say that okay, cap Ferrari and everyone else 125 million, but then the other teams are not going to get that amount of in car stuff which comes from these teams as well. I see merit there.
I'm not sure about that because I think when the devil the devil's in the detail, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
um, these are all arguments that carry on in the usual political world of F1, but it's quite simple. You can take out engine development, for example. If you take engine development out of the budget cap and say this is an operational cap for the race team, which is the same then for everybody, and then you have engine development separate. So that takes away your question about manufacturers having to spend more, right? So everything is workable and fixable. It's just unfortunately, F1 people are wired in such a way that they think of themselves first. And I guess that's the nature of sport, right? You have to be selfish and you have to be you have to be thinking of yourself to be successful. That's whether that's the nature of of any sport, I guess, whether you're tennis or whatever. So I think, but at this point, it needs a strong leader. It needs people like Chase Carey and John Todd to be strong leaders and say, all right, this is what we have to do to survive this crisis, come out the other side, and then rebuild from here. Because there's a chance where I think we are slightly on the precipice where F1 could go back to being independent, more independent teams who are, and then the manufacturers are just engine suppliers,
Mhm.
which is what, frankly, we had. Forget apart from Ferrari, but if you that was the model that ran for a lot of time till I would say probably till the early 90s even.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
had Williams with a Renault engine, you had Benetton with a Ford
yeah.
engine, you had independent teams with an engine partner. So I think the model could well change if the auto industry doesn't recover and the manufacturer teams think we need to cut back here on our expenditure. Maybe they will go back to just being engine suppliers, like Honda are doing, for example, right? Honda are not
Mm,
a full team; they've partnered with Red Bull, and there's nothing
mm.
wrong with that. That's part of the DNA of the sport.
Yeah, and also, as you spoke about teams being selfish, there's also issues about trust deficits as well. Before we went into this break, the first break, there was this massive problem with the Ferrari settlement with the FIA over the engines of 2019. Are teams entitled to ask FIA for transparency? And is the FIA and Formula One, should they be transparent for the sake of the sport? That's also another question.
I think I can understand why the teams are not happy about it. If I'm honest, I'm a little bit surprised that the FIA announced that there was some form of settlement. In the past, I'm sure that when Bernie was in charge, there were various deals and settlements done along the way that none of us knew about. They were just happy behind closed doors, and it was done and dusted. So I think the fact, for whatever reason, the FIA decided that they wanted to publicly acknowledge that there was a settlement has upset all of the other teams. But I think in some ways, because of the corona crisis that's gone on, that whole issue has gone on the back burner. There are much
Mhm.
bigger issues to solve at the moment.
Okay, layman's question: how do Formula One drivers now in this period stay fit? Again, speaking to Rohan Bopanna and other Indian sports persons, especially those who are training for the Olympics, obviously with the lockdown in place, they can't step out of their houses. Some are finding ways to adapt inside their drawing rooms. Some, like Rohan, are in Coors, so they can go for a run. Most Formula One drivers will probably have a gym at home, will have access to simulators. Do they have sort of an advantage, or do they need to spend time in the car as well?
No, I mean, listen, nothing beats being in the car, but as you say, it's the same for every sport, right? Everyone's got an issue right now. So I think everyone's got a setup of some form at home. For example, I've got a rowing machine, so you can see the blisters on my hand. I've been smashing out, you know, an hour or so on the rowing machine. Or you go for a run outdoors where it's quiet. People are finding their own ways, like you say, to make it work.
Mm.
People like Valtteri Bottas have gone up north in Finland where there's nobody around and he's skiing to stay fit. People like Carlos Sainz have gone back to their homes in Madrid where he's got a gym at home and he can carry on training in his house. And everyone's just trying to make it work, right? I guess, I mean, it's harder for the Olympic athlete because they spend they spend 4 years aiming to get to the right peak,
Mm.
and now that I don't think it's necessarily the case for tennis players because they have a whole other season. But certainly, I think for pure athletics, I feel really bad for them because they would have spent their entire time preparing for the peak to be in for Tokyo 2020, and that's
Yeah.
now had to be pushed a year. So how do they balance that? That training must be very difficult for them.
Yes, because one of the interesting anecdotes which I was told once, at Rio probably, was that imagine Usain Bolt or a 100 meters runner. They train 4 years just for 9.5 seconds.
Yeah,
That that's
exactly, right.
that's the smallest for them. For a 100-meter runner, it's nine
Yeah.
and a half to 10 seconds. That's it. You train for that. And if you screw up those 10 seconds, it's 4 years gone.
Yeah.
Anyway, also speaking to Pankaj Advani yesterday, and Pankaj made an important point because he doesn't have a billiards table at home, so he can't train. He says when this is eventually over, when sport resumes, there are a lot of people around the world who are going to be extremely rusty. That it's going to be a level playing field initially uh, for people to sort of find out where they are, getting back to practice. It's going to take some time. Do you see a similar level playing field in Formula One, considering that not much development is happening? Most factories are shut because of the virus as well, and obviously because the season's shut right now, no developments happening as well.
Well, I think this is where, to take Pankaj's point, I think this is where the organizational ability of a team or a federation, frankly, in Pankaj's case or Olympic athletes' case, things like the Indian Olympic Association, people like that should be helping them, or their respective sports federation. In F1's case, the teams, like Alex Albon was saying the other day, as soon as the lockdown happened, Red Bull sent him a load of equipment from a gym for him to set up at home so he could carry on training. He didn't own any of this stuff before, but they went, okay, we've got to make sure you're prepared, and they've got simulator tools and things like that for him to keep sharp and keep going. And I think this is where the good and organized teams are being good about it. So Pierre Gasly, for example, is in self isolation with his trainer. So he and his trainer are effectively the family who are living together, and that means the trainer is still pushing him hard, and he's still training hard every day. And I think this is where the good Olympic federations or the good sporting federations or the teams will be able to help their athletes, and should be helping their athletes.
Okay. I did initially say that F1 has a sort of a reputation as being a snobbish sport, but we're also seeing the good. We also seeing teams coming together,
Mm.
figure out masks, ventilators, all kinds of other equipment to battle the pandemic. And this is great to see everyone chipping in, considering that how advanced Formula One is in terms of R&D.
So, for example, and well, actually, let me restart. Basically, there's various ways that F1 are helping. You're absolutely right. There are 7 of the teams in the UK who've all got together and formed what's called Project Pitlane, where they're all working together. But also they're working independently, and under that Project Pitlane, they've got different streams of work happening. Mercedes have done a great job. They very quickly developed effectively a CPAP machine. For those of you familiar with it. It's not something you'd use in the ICU, but it's sort of for people just outside the ICU. It's not a very complicated machine. It's not a very expensive machine. You can make it high volume. But what is really, really good is that Mercedes have made the drawings open source. So, Diggy, you in Delhi can go to a manufacturer who's got medical manufacturing capabilities, or somebody in Indore or in Timbuktu, and can literally download the Mercedes F1 drawings and produce it to help
Mm.
patients in your country and in hospitals in your area, which is fantastic. I think that's a great initiative. Similarly, the other teams are working on a full ventilator system. And just speaking to one of the engineers the other day about how that's going, they're saying this was actually the basis was something that was originally done by the British military, and it was a work in progress. They'd spent a few years developing it, but what's taken them 2 years to get to a certain point, the F1 engineers have got in there, and in 2 weeks they've turned the whole thing into something that was a working design into something that's actually ready for testing on patients now in 2 weeks. And that's the speed that F1 people work, right? They see a problem at one race, and in 2 weeks time they have to fix it by the next race. And when you get 7 teams, the engineers of 7 teams together, that's what they're capable of doing. So it's been amazing. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for sharing this with us because I had no idea that these were open source. As I wind things down, I can see behind you one racing helmet. I think there's one more somewhere else, which I can't
Somewhere
see.
there's one there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there it is. Yeah, with the India colors. So we have these virtual races going on, Karun Ryder. What do you think of them? And are we going to see you in one of these virtual races? Come on, let's
Uh,
see Karun back in virtual racing at least.
No, it is fun. I think it's a bit of fun. But I think what you'll notice, Diggy, is that all the people taking part in virtual racing have either got no children or they've got children who they're able to, put away in a different room with their toys. I unfortunately have a 16-month-old who is whose nickname is Captain Chaos, who doesn't sit still, and if I had a gaming pod, he would be grabbing at it. So I think I might have to hold off for a couple more years before before I find other ways to entertain him.
But Captain Chaos, I like the name considering the sport you come from, and because your dad Vicky's always been around cars, so probably your house was always chaos. Considering the kind of lifestyle you all have, it's all around motorsport. But Karun, thank you so much. Take care of Captain Chaos. You and Akshara keep coming up with some nice dishes, sort of motivate people like me who at times decide to go into the kitchen and
This-
probably cook up something.
yeah,
You have
listen, this
access
is
to fish. I have no fish here. Just chicken, which we have. Yeah.
this is the time to be experimental, right? We're not cooking for anybody else, so if it's bad, you can find a way to fix it.
Yes, we all are perhaps together in this. Everyone's going to work together to fix it, like you said. Karun, thanks so
But
much
stay
for.
separate, but don't stay
Yes,
together.
stay separate.
That's
Yes,
the key.
yes. That's the
So yeah.
key. Maricom's already threatened me. She said, "I'll punch you if you move out too much." So that's what happens when you spend too much time with sports persons. But anyway, thank you so much, Karun. Stay safe, and thanks for explaining this to us because for all of us who are a bit away from the technical world of Formula One, at times it gets a bit too much, like a bit of a bouncer, as you know, in cricket. So thanks for simplifying things for us, and hopefully we get to see action soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Tiggy. Thank you very much.